This week on Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News, cities across the state have plans in place focused on those experiencing housing insecurity.
2,200 people have been moved off the streets in the city of Denver.
And there are nonprofits helping those most at risk of becoming unhoused.
They're really effective, especially at addressing issues of temporary homelessness.
So why are people still struggling to find stability?
We chat with reporters from Colorado Springs, Grand Junction, and Denver on what they're seeing in their communities, with the hope of finding a common thread for possible solutions.
Welcome to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando-Frescas.
And I'm Denver7's Micah Smith. Each week, in a partnership between Denver7 and CPR, we have a real talk about issues impacting underrepresented people across Colorado and amplifying voices you may not always hear.
Last year, right around Christmas, Colorado experienced a cold snap. Temps plummeted well below zero. While many of us were snug in our beds, thousands across the state struggled to find warmth during the bitterly cold temperatures.
And some even died. One of them was 51-year-old Denise King in Colorado Springs. Initial reports suggested that she died from hypothermia, but it was later determined she died of a drug overdose. Her story highlights the intersection between housing insecurity and substance use challenges. Reporter Noel Black wrote about King for the Colorado Springs Independent.
And in Grand Junction, CPR's Western Slope reporter Stina Sieg has also met numerous of the city's unhoused, writing about their struggles just to find a place to use the bathroom.
And Denver7 executive reporter Russell Haythorne has covered the Denver housing crisis.
So we wanted to get them all together to talk about their interactions and have a real talk about why the problem is so pervasive in their cities.
Let's first hear from Russell Haythorne, who's in the studio with us and has seen firsthand the actions of city leaders and the struggles of the unhoused community. Russell, thank you so much for joining us for this Real Talk.
Yeah, Mike and Nathan, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You know, Denver has taken some pretty bold steps in recent years, some that have received national attention. But what are you seeing from on the ground with relation to homelessness?
Well, on the ground, I think if we're talking in terms of change, there has been a big change in Denver. Now, some say the change has been for the better. Some say it's been stagnant. Some say it's worse. There's certainly no question for those of us who have been downtown that the encampments that we saw under the previous administration are no longer there. And the Johnston administration likes to say that in the 350 block radius of downtown Denver, those large encampments are now gone. You know, I can think of one in particular that I reported on quite a bit, was on the corner of where the old Firestone tire station was. And people might be familiar with other businesses that are there. The British Bulldog Pub and Triangle Bar used to exist on that block as well. And that encampment almost encircled the entire block, and it included tents and mattresses and filth and human waste and trash, and that is now gone. And they're patrolling those areas to ensure that those encampments don't pop up again. As you know, Mayor Johnston made it one of his signature issues during his campaign in 2023 for mayor to tackle the homeless problem. And he launched almost immediately after taking office. And at first they called it House 1000, which was an effort to get 1,000 people off the streets by the end of 2023. And by and large, that was successful. And then in 2024, they aimed at getting another 1,000 people off the streets, and that was successful as well. I just took a look at the dashboard before coming into your studio, and it suggests that since Mayor Johnston took office, that 2,200 people have been moved off the streets in the city of Denver. Of those, 1,800 remain housed. And the vast majority of those people being moved off the streets are being moved into hotels that the city has either purchased or leased, or tiny home villages or micro communities. We're doing well, I think, by most standards in terms of putting people in temporary housing. But if you ask homeless advocates across the nation, temporary housing isn't a permanent solution, right? And the dashboard suggests that of the 1,800 people who remain housed at the moment, only 38% of them are in permanent housing. So the prevailing thought is, if this is going to be sustainable, you're eventually going to have to get more people into permanent housing. But that's a tricky business, especially in places like Metro Denver, where there's just not a glut of housing available.
Well, that, and I think there's a lot of criticism against the Johnson administration in terms of how much we're spending on housing people who are unhoused, how aggressive he was at the beginning, what constitutes an encampment. Are we sweeping or are we really housing? Russell, you had a really rare opportunity for a local news reporter to step outside of our viewing area, and you went to Houston because Houston has a homelessness problem and they've been able to address it in a really effective way. So why did you go to Houston? What did you see there?
Well, you said Houston has a homelessness issue. I think many would argue that Houston had a homelessness issue, and now they're the model for the nation, and sometimes they're the model for the world in terms of how they tackled it. In 2011, Houston had the 5th highest homeless population in the country of any major city. They had 9,000 people living on the streets, and since then, they've moved about 6,000 indoors. 9 out of 10 people that they put into housing remain in housing. So it's had a 90% effectiveness rate if you look at it like that. Denver estimates, like I said, 1,800 remained housed of 2,200. So there's about an 8 and 10 effectiveness rate there. Houston's very different, though, from Denver because Houston does not believe in temporary housing like hotels and micro communities. Houston says it has to be permanent housing. Granted, Houston has a glut of housing available, right? Unlike Denver, they had apartments, they had single family homes that they could put people in. But they argue that there has to be a key, right? A key handed over to an individual to a real unit in a real house or a real apartment, because then you create accountability with that person. They want to keep that home. Now, the other way their model differs is that they have an amazing network of nonprofits working with the city to keep people housed through affordable housing and services available. So Houston has like 100 non-governmental entities working with the city to help people get into housing. They called it a divide and conquer approach. So if you think about those encampments that existed in Denver, Civic Heart Community Services, for example, would take one encampment, right? And they'd go out and they'd address say there's a dozen people living in that encampment. Civic Heart would go out, log the person, make sure they're in the system, and then they would get them keys to a unit that day. So they're getting them off the streets and into units immediately. And they've done this for years.
I think that's important insight because I think a lot of times when you're in your own city, you can't really think beyond your own city. You're looking for solutions that have worked in your city in the past. So when we talk about other cities, I think that can be really helpful to what we're dealing with here in Denver and in Colorado in general. And with that in mind, Russell, we have a lot more we want to discuss with you, but we do want to bring in a few more voices. So for now, thank you.
Coming up, we'll hear from reporters in Colorado Springs and Grand Junction who are both joining us remotely. This is Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando-Frescas. Today we're looking at the issue of Coloradans who don't have a place to call home. We know the problem and how big it is. Thousands are unhoused across the state.
In a point-in-time count last year, more than 770,000 people across the state were unhoused on a single night in January 2024.
The amount of people living in shelters, temporary housing, or on the streets increased 30% compared to the year before. And city leaders have complex plans to solve this evolving crisis. And we know nonprofits are working tirelessly to help those most in need.
But over and over, stories reported by Colorado journalists continuing to show the struggles of those that still can't find shelter, a hand up, or even a place to use the bathroom.
Yeah, CPR's Western Slope reporter Stina Sieg has been covering Grand Junction and the Western Slope for years, as well as the growing homeless population there. She joins us now from the CPR studio in downtown Grand Junction. Stina, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Stina, Grand Junction has one of the highest per capita populations of people without stable housing in Colorado. Can you talk about what you're seeing on the ground?
Well, you're seeing a lot of people in the past. There were a lot of people that you would see visibly, in these parks with their tents and with their dogs. Now it's much more dispersed because in 2023, the city manager closed the sort of center of the unhoused community. It was a park that had become a place that people lived and also got services like food and some medical services and stuff like that. And so now, depending on what part of town you're in, either you see no unhoused people or you see a lot of unhoused people. And the town, the city has created this day like resource center that's just south of downtown, and they created it with a local nonprofit. And so when you go there, you see people doing anything from getting coffee to getting help getting their ID that maybe they lost, several years ago, and maybe they're just sitting there with their dog, having a hot meal. But the picture of homelessness is really different than Denver. It's much less visible, but it's actually more severe than in Denver.
How so? Explain that a little bit more. Why is it more of a challenge there than in Denver?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that there's nowhere to go. In Denver, there might be you might go to another city, you might take a bus somewhere else. Here, we're really the end of the line. We have the most temperate weather anywhere on the Western Slope. So people really converge in Grand Junction because they can survive a winter here, where you really couldn't in Silverton or in Ouray, and so it becomes a draw, but also because we have services that none of these other small communities would have. We have the only overnight shelter that would take anybody between Salt Lake City and Denver.
CPR's Western Slope reporter, Stina Seek. Thanks so much, Stina. Stick around. We're now going to bring in Noel Black, senior writer with the Colorado Springs Independent. Noel, thanks so much for being here for this Real Talk. Your story with Denise King underscores this complex relationship between housing insecurity and substance abuse. From your perspective, how do these issues intertwine in your city of Colorado Springs?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because Colorado Springs is unique in that we don't provide much, if any, relatively speaking, public funding to address these issues, and so much of it has to be addressed by private nonprofits and charities. Denise King was a person that I wrote about who, on the last day of the year, was found frozen in her tent, and the autopsy did turn back that she had a fentanyl and meth overdose. But I think her death, rattled a lot of people just because of the degree of the problem that just kind of won't seem to go away. And again, we seem to, count on these local nonprofit service organizations. Springs Rescue Mission in Colorado Springs is one, and I just want to say they do an incredible job. They use so many of the best practices, and they're really effective, especially at addressing issues of temporary homelessness. But like many other places, we also have a huge shortage of affordable housing to get people into those permanent housing situations. It just seems like, we can't address the more visible homelessness issues, the chronically homeless, and those are issues that affect, downtown businesses, people who are not necessarily equipped to help, despite the fact that they would very much like to. So it seems like we kind of, keep putting Band-Aids on things. Mayor Yemi Mawalade released a 2025 homelessness response action plan, and many of the things in there are things that constituents want to see, like cleaning up the camps that are along Fountain Creek, faster response time for downtown businesses to address issues, a number of things that are wonderful on paper, but I think that aren't going to strike at the part of the problem, which is getting people housed, getting them the services they need.
All right. Noel Black, a senior writer with the Colorado Springs Independent. Stay with us, Noel. We're going to bring everyone back to talk more because coming up, Russell, Stina, and Noel will join us for a roundtable to share their thoughts and perspectives on what connects their stories and what needs to happen to make a real impact.
Stay with us. This is Real Talk from Denver7 and CPR News.
Welcome back to Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. I'm Denver7's Micah Smith.
And I'm Colorado Public Radio's Nathan Fernando-Frescas. Today we're taking a hard, honest look at the issue of housing insecurity.
Cities like Denver, Grand Junction, and Colorado Springs have all made efforts to address the crisis. But despite that, journalists across the state keep reporting on the same struggles.
Yeah. And so we have three journalists that are joining us today, rejoining us for this conversation. Noel, I want to start with you in Colorado Springs. You had a question for Russell, who is here in Denver, about the cost of all of this.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about the costs that Houston is looking at in particular, because though there has been a lot of research done about the costs to the public of people being on the streets, and it's been fairly well documented that it is far cheaper to house people and give them treatment and services long term. The upfront costs of making that transition can oftentimes be shocking and upsetting to the public. And I'm curious how they've handled that in Houston.
Yeah, I think Houston's divide and conquer approach is really working for them, and they sort of distribute the costs among those nonprofit partners that they're working with on a regular basis. And so Houston also allocated, I think, $100 million in public funds to address the problem just for this year alone. But that is one of the major challenges, I think. The estimate here in Denver is that the mayor's program so far, or his initiative, has cost the city $150 million so far. And then the mayor's office is estimating that it will cost an additional $50 to $60 million this year alone in 2025. It is certainly a burden for many cities. And Houston estimates, to your point, Noel, it costs the city $50,000 a year for one individual to sleep on the streets, whereas to put them in housing, permanent housing, costs the city $20,000 a year.
And Noel, I want to bring you back in here because, Russell, you brought up really good examples of the cost. What is the cost? How you spread the costs out. Noel, would you say one of the biggest barriers to preventing effective solutions in Colorado Springs is the lack of public funding? I mean, you touched on this. Would you say that's the biggest barrier?
I mean, I think the irony of all of this is that there is an enormous amount of public funding going towards homelessness issues. And again, I think the mayor's office, they're trying to put together more accurate numbers, but the difficulty is always trying to get an accurate count and what all services are people using, how much of those costs are being picked up by the taxpayers, how much of those costs are being picked up by nonprofits or hospitals. It's really difficult to make those calculations, but Russell, those were the same numbers roughly that I'm seeing here, which is essentially 50,000 for people to live on the street and 20,000 to get them housed. And the problem with that 50,000 number, of course, is those costs are all hidden. They're coming out of areas of the budget where they aren't allocated. Those are not dollars that are being set aside to take care of people on the street. I think saying essentially, whether you like it or not, we're spending this $50,000 on people on the streets. And really, again, I'm not in any way suggesting that the nonprofits aren't doing a fantastic job, but I think we do need to start giving them more public monies and figuring out ways to keep the funding for those things steady, to help get people off the street permanently, which long term is going to save people even more tax dollars. Even if we were to sell a 1 mil, 1 penny for every $10 sales tax, we could easily fund the amount of money per year that it would take to get people off the streets. I would say the biggest impediment to doing anything like that in Colorado Springs is the minute that you say the word tax, there is a knee-jerk no.
Stina, I want to bring you into the conversation. I see you shaking your head a lot. What do you want to say about the funding issue? Of course, the Western Slope, maybe a little bit tax averse there. Are you seeing similar issues?
It's very tax averse. It's very, very hard in Grand Junction to get anyone to vote for something that isn't just the expansion of a high school. One of the things I was really interested about with Noel was this idea of central services, having services all in one place. And when I think about Colorado Springs being so sprawling, and then I think about Grand Junction, which is relatively compact, but it's still the same issue where, we would only maybe have 1 or 2 miles between services, but for a community where the bus service isn't that robust, and people wouldn't have the money for the bus anyway, that might as well be 6 towns over. And so one of the things that is in the works now is they're going to move. They have a temporary resource center for unhoused people that's right downtown, but the overnight shelter is about 2 miles away, and they're looking at moving this resource center right next to the overnight shelter, which would give people sort of like a one-stop shop. The idea of how to solve this, and there's a big question here about whether it's solvable, homelessness, is that it's about gaining trust. And when you have those services in a central location, the likelihood that all this trust would be built is much higher.
We only have about 2 minutes left, but I want to give each of you kind of 30 seconds. I know that is not a lot of time at all. Just to share with our listeners and our viewers what you think, in general, people are missing from this overall conversation when it comes to solutions to homelessness.
We hit on it just a moment ago in that gaining trust. And again, not to go back to Houston's model, but they talk about that a lot, about the trust that they need to gain from the general public and those who are unhoused in terms of buying into this program or this initiative. They do that by making contact with unhoused individuals, and in most cases, immediately getting them into housing. And if that doesn't build trust, I don't know what does.
When you have systemic problems, you can't necessarily leave those solutions in local, municipal hands, because that problem will then just end up popping up somewhere else. And I think as a country, as a state, we really need to start thinking about these problems more systemically and realizing that, allocating monies from a state or a federal level, getting the sufficient funds into communities everywhere is what's really going to solve the homelessness problem.
There's no one answer. And every solution has to start with gaining that trust from the unhoused. And that process is so slow. And, maybe it means that they come to a day shelter and they just get a cup of coffee or they get a shower. And maybe they have to come 5 times or 10 times or 50 times before they're ready to have a conversation about getting into permanent housing or, getting sober off of alcohol or drugs. And so that slow process is not the sexy answer people want, but that seems to be what's working the best here in Grand Junction.
All right, Stina Sieg, Noel Black, and Russell Haythorne, thank you all so much for all of your insight into this issue, and thank you for joining us for this Real Talk.
My pleasure. Our pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's this week's episode of Real Talk with Denver7 and CPR News. Every week, we have a Real Talk on issues that impact Coloradans who are often overlooked.
You can find all of our episodes on denver7.com/realtalk or at cpr.org/realtalk. Have a great day.